The Sea of Japan, March 21st, 1984. It is a world of absolute, crushing darkness. Down here, 150 feet beneath the surface, the sun is a memory. There is no day, there is no night. There is only the rhythm of the watch schedule and the recycled air that tastes faintly of ozone and machine oil. For the crew of the Soviet nuclear-powered attack submarine K314, the world is defined not by sight, but by sound. They are listening for a ghost. Captain Vladimir Evsienko stands in the control room, his eyes scanning the gauges that glow with a dull, sickly amber light. He is a man under immense pressure. His command, a Project 671 submarine known to NATO forces as the Victor I class, is a predator. It is designed to hunt. It is fast, heavily armed with torpedoes, and rugged. But tonight, the predator feels uncomfortably like prey. Their target is the USS Kittyhawk, a conventionally powered supercarrier designated CV-63. This floating city, displacing over 80,000 tons of steel, is the centerpiece of a massive American projection of power. Above the waves, the Americans are conducting Team Spirit, a joint naval exercise with South Korea. It is a flex of military muscle intended to rattle the windows in Vladivostok. The Soviet High Command demands intelligence. They want acoustic signatures, propeller revolution counts, and intercept data on the carrier's defensive screen. They want Evsienko to get close. But the Kittyhawk is playing a dangerous game. For days, the K314 has been engaged in a high-stakes match of cat and mouse. The Soviet submarine had tracked the carrier group successfully earlier in the week, shadowing the massive vessel as it churned through the cold waters. But then the acoustic picture changed. The Americans went dark. In the lexicon of naval warfare, this is known as emissions control, or EMCON. The carrier group ceased radar transmissions. They minimized radio chatter. They began to move with a calculated, terrifying silence. To the sonar operators aboard the Soviet submarine, the massive American fleet simply evaporated. One moment, the ocean was filled with the mechanical thrum of gas turbines and the cavitating screws of destroyer escorts. The next, there was only the ambient hiss of the sea, the crackle of shrimp, the groan of thermal layers shifting, and the vast, empty quiet. Evsienko is frustrated. Losing a target of that size is a black mark on a captain's record. But more than that, it is dangerous. A carrier never travels alone. It is surrounded by a screen of destroyers and frigates, specifically designed to hunt submarines. If Evsienko cannot hear them, he cannot evade them. He is flying blind in a room full of knives. The sonar operator presses the headphones tighter to his ears, his face a mask of intense concentration. He filters through the background noise, looking for the telltale rhythm of propeller blades. Nothing. The hydrophones pick up only the chaotic static of the open ocean. The thermal layers, bands of water with different temperatures, are playing tricks on them, refracting sound waves, creating acoustic blind spots where a ship as large as a skyscraper could hide undetected. Subscribe to Cold War Impact for more declassified histories of the silent conflict beneath the waves. The tension in the command center is palpable. Sweat beads on the foreheads of the warrant officers. They know the doctrine. If they are detected by the Americans while trying to penetrate the carrier screen, the response will be aggressive. The Americans will simulate attacks, dropping active sonar buoys that ping against the hull like hammers, a psychological warfare tactic to drive the Soviet sub away. But the silence is worse than the pings. The silence implies the Americans are up to something they don't want seen. Captain Evsienko makes a decision. If he cannot hear them in the deep, he must go to where the physics of sound cannot hide them. He orders the boat up. Periscope depth, he commands. The order is relayed in hushed, disciplined Russian. The ballast tanks hiss as compressed air forces water out. The deck angles upward. The K314 begins a slow, blind ascent toward the surface. The plan is risky but necessary. They will rise just enough to extend the antennas and the periscope, taking a visual fix or catching a radar emission that might reveal the carrier's location. They need to reacquire the target before the exercise shifts location again. As the submarine rises, the sonar picture remains confusingly empty. There is a sense of unease among the acoustic team. Usually, as a submarine ascends, the sound channel clears. They should hear the distant churn of commercial traffic or the biological noise of whales. Instead, there is a strange, heavy dampening effect. It is as if a heavy blanket has been thrown over the ocean surface above them. They pass 100 feet. Then 80. The captain waits by the periscope stand, ready to hoist the optical mast the moment they break the surface tension. He expects to see empty ocean, or perhaps the distant grey shapes of the American fleet on the horizon. He expects to correct his course and dive back into the safety of the deep. He does not know that he is rising into a trap of his own making. The K314 is suffering from a specific tactical blindness. The Victor 1 class, while powerful, has a baffle area, directly behind it a cone of silence where its own propeller turbulence blinds its rear-facing sonar. But the issue tonight isn't what is behind them, it is what is directly above them. The ocean dynamics in the Sea of Japan are treacherous. Strong currents and sharp temperature gradients can bend sound waves upward, away from a submarine's sensors. The K314 thinks it is alone in a patch of empty sea. At 10:22 p.m., the depth gauge reads periscope depth. Evsienko grips the handles of the periscope. Suddenly, the world ends. There is no warning, no sonar ping, no alarm, just a violent, earth-shattering collision that throws every man in the control room off his feet. The sound is not an explosion, it is worse. It is the screaming tear of metal on metal, a deafening, grinding roar that vibrates through the teeth and bones of the crew. The entire 69-meter submarine rolls violently to the starboard side, shuddering as if it has been kicked by a giant. Pipes burst. High-pressure air lines hiss like angry vipers. The lighting system fails instantly, plunging the command center into total darkness before the emergency red battle lanterns flicker to life, casting long, terrified shadows against the hull. "Report!" Evsienko screams over the din of alarms. "What hit us? Torpedo impact?" The crew is scrambling, picking themselves up from the deck plates. The initial thought is unanimous. We are under attack. The Americans have fired. The Cold War has just turned hot. The submarine shudders again, a second, heavier impact striking the fin, the sail of the submarine. This impact is different. It sounds like a rhythmic chopping, a massive mechanical blade slicing through the water and the steel skin of the boat. Thud, 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 thud. It is the sound of a propeller. But not a torpedo propeller. This is something massive. "Propeller noise directly above," the sonar operator yells, his voice cracking with panic. "High RPM, massive displacement." The submarine is being pushed down, physically shoved back into the depths by an immense weight. The hull groans under the strain, the steel ribs protesting the unnatural force. For a few terrifying seconds, the K314 is pinned, scraping along the bottom of something impossibly large. Then, the pressure releases. The submarine is tossed into the turbulent wake of a passing leviathan, tumbling like a toy in a washing machine. The screw, the submarine's own propeller, makes a sickening, grinding noise, and then stops. "We have lost propulsion," the engineering officer reports. "Starboard stabilizer damaged. The screw is gone. We are drifting." Evsienko grabs the railing to steady himself. The red light washes over his face, revealing a mix of shock and calculation. They haven't been hit by a weapon. They have been run over. But by what? There was nothing on the sonar. Nothing. A ship large enough to crush a nuclear submarine and survive, the impact does not simply appear out of thin air. It creates noise. It creates a pressure wave. How could a vessel of that magnitude sneak up on a warship designed for listening? "Damage control parties to the forward compartments," Evsienko orders, his voice steadying. "Check for hull breaches. Monitor radiation levels. Get me a status on the ballast tanks." The K314 is dead in the water. She is drifting in the hostile currents of the Sea of Japan, crippled, blind, and deaf. The propeller shaft is likely twisted or sheared off. If the pressure hull is compromised, they will not be able to surface. They will sink to the crushed depth, and the ocean will claim them. "Captain," the executive officer whispers, stepping close, "if we surface, and it is the Americans, they will see us." Evsienko nods grimly. He knows the implications. To surface a secret Soviet submarine in the middle of a US naval exercise is not just a humiliation. It is an intelligence disaster. It exposes their technology, their frequencies, and their failure to the enemy. But they have no choice. The air banks are holding, but without propulsion, they are a steel coffin waiting to sink. "Blow the main ballast tanks," Evsienko says. "Emergency surface. Prepare the signal flares." As the compressed air roars into the tanks, forcing the crippled boat upward, the crew prepares for the unknown. They do not know what awaits them on the surface. Is the ship that hit them sinking? Are there American destroyers circling, weapons trained on the water, waiting for the Soviet aggressor to emerge? The submarine breaches the surface, rolling unsteadily in the heavy swell. Evsienko climbs the ladder to the bridge, cracking the hatch open. The cold night air rushes in, smelling of salt and diesel. He pushes himself up and out onto the sail, scanning the darkness with his binoculars. He expects to see a tanker, perhaps a large container ship that had strayed off course. Instead, he sees a mountain of steel moving away from him. 2,000 yards away, illuminated by the stern lights and the faint glow of the moon, is the unmistakable silhouette of an aircraft carrier. It is massive, a flat-topped fortress blocking out the stars, and it is turning. The Kittyhawk. They hadn't just found the target. They had surfaced directly under its keel. But as Evsienko watches the carrier's lights, a new, chilling realization washes over him. The carrier isn't stopping. It isn't launching rescue boats. It is continuing its turn, its massive wake churning the water where the K314 now floats helplessly. The Americans don't know they hit a submarine, or worse, they know, and they are coming back to finish the job. The radio operator calls up from the hatch. "Captain, we are picking up American unencrypted chatter. Panic!" on the frequencies. What are they saying? They are saying they hit a mystery object. They think they hit a whale, Captain, or a Soviet mine. Evsienko looks at his crippled ship. The sail is smashed, the missile hatches are likely damaged, the propeller is gone. He is floating in the center of the greatest naval armada on Earth, completely defenseless. And now, on the horizon, the shapes of the escort destroyers are changing course. They are turning toward the K314. Their searchlights sweep the water, cutting through the darkness like lightsabers. The hunt is over. The humiliation is just beginning. The spotlight from the American destroyer hits the conning tower of the K314 with physical force. It is blinding. For the Soviet sailors standing on the bridge, the beam cuts through the night like an interrogation lamp, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. There is no hiding now. The sleek black hull of the Victor I submarine, designed to be the ultimate stealth hunter, is now bobbing helplessly in the swell, illuminated for the entire world to see. On the bridge of the USS Kittyhawk, the atmosphere shifts from confusion to a cold, hard realization. Captain David N. Rogers stands looking out at the wake of his massive ship. The reports are flooding in from the damage control center. The carrier is bleeding aviation fuel. There is a hole in the hull near the bow, specifically in the No. 2 jet fuel storage tank. But more concerning is what the lookouts have just spotted. A piece of metal is embedded in the carrier's hull. It is not a piece of debris or a whalebone. It is a chunk of a bronze propeller. And stuck in the jagged tear of the Kittyhawk's steel skin are tiles, anechoic rubber tiles, the kind used to coat Soviet submarines to absorb sonar waves. "It's a sub," Rogers says, the realization settling heavily in the room. "We ran over a Soviet submarine." The implications are terrifying. A collision between a surface ship and a submarine usually ends in catastrophe for the submarine. If the pressure hull of the Soviet boat has been cracked, 70 or more sailors are currently drowning or being crushed to death just a mile astern. Worse, if the reactor containment is breached, they are looking at a radiological incident in international waters, right in the middle of a high-tension naval exercise. "Get the helos in the air," Rogers orders. "I want visual confirmation on the target. Find out if they are sinking. And prepare the escorts. If this is a trap, or if there are other subs out there, I want to know." Back on the drifting K314, Captain Evsienko is trying to maintain order in a situation that is rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. The initial panic of the collision has faded, replaced by a dread that is cold and sharp. The submarine is not sinking, but it is crippled. The propeller shaft is twisted beyond repair. The screw, the massive 7-bladed propeller that drives the boat, is sheared off, resting somewhere on the bottom of the Sea of Japan or lodged in the American carrier. The engineering officer reports that the reactor is stable, but they have no propulsion. They are dead weight. The currents are pushing them, and the waves are tossing the 69-meter tube roughly. Inside, the air is getting stale. The ventilation systems are struggling, but the real threat is above them. The thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades cuts through the air. An American SH-3 Sea King helicopter swoops low over the water, its searchlight sweeping the deck of the Soviet boat. It comes in, Close, dangerously close, the downdraft whipping the spray into the faces of the Soviet watch officers. To the Americans in the helicopter, the scene is surreal. They are looking down at one of the Soviet Navy's most capable attack submarines, floating like a stunned fish. They can see the damage to the sail, the twisted metal where the stabilizer fins were impacted. They can see the Soviet sailors looking up, shielding their eyes from the glare. For Evsienko, this is the ultimate professional humiliation. A submarine captain's primary weapon is invisibility. To be seen is to fail. To be run over and then forced to float on the surface while the enemy takes photographs is a failure of historic proportions. But amidst the shame, the mystery gnaws at him. He leaves the bridge and descends back into the control room. It is lit by the eerie red battle lanterns. He moves to the sonar station. The operators are still wearing their headsets, looking at their screens with expressions of utter bewilderment. "Play it back," Evsienko orders. "Comrade Captain, there is nothing to play back," the senior sonar officer says, his voice trembling. "The tapes are blank." "That is impossible." Evsienko snaps. An 80,000-ton aircraft carrier moving at 15 knots does not move silently. It makes noise. The screws alone churn enough water to be heard for 50 miles. The machinery, the pumps, the flow noise against the hull, it should have been deafening. "I know, Captain," the operator insists, pointing at the waterfall display, the visual representation of sound over time. "But look, here is the timestamp for 10:21 p.m. 1 minute before impact. Nothing. Just background static, sea state noise, shrimp, distant traffic." Evsienko leans in, staring at the green lines. It defies physics. The Kittyhawk should have appeared as a massive, thick band of noise on this display, growing louder and louder until it washed out everything else. Instead, the display shows a ghost. The carrier simply wasn't there acoustically until the metal of its keel slammed into their sail. "Check the equipment," Evsienko growls. "We must have a fault in the hydrophones." "We have checked, Captain. The hydrophones are operational. We can hear the American destroyers now. We can hear the shrimp. The gear is working." This is the terrifying part of the mystery. If their equipment is working, and the Americans didn't employ some new, magical cloaking technology, then something fundamental about the ocean environment betrayed them. They were blindfolded by the sea itself. On the surface, the situation is escalating. The American escort ship, the frigate USS Callahan, has pulled alongside the drifting submarine. It stays at a wary distance, its guns manned but not trained directly on the Soviet boat. The Americans are signaling with light lamps. "Do you require assistance?" Evsienko reads the message relayed by the signalman. The answer is a complex political calculus. If he accepts American help, he hands the United States a massive propaganda victory. Soviet submarine rescued by the very navy it was hunting. It would be splashed across every newspaper in the Western world. But if he refuses, and the weather turns, he risks the lives of his crew. "Decline assistance," Evsienko orders. "Signal them. We are experiencing mechanical difficulties. We are awaiting Soviet auxiliary vessels. Maintain a rigid watch. If they try to board us, we repel them." It is a bluff. Help is a long way off. The Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok has been notified, and the response was a mixture of fury and panic. A frantic rescue operation is being organized. The Kara-class cruiser Petropavlovsk is steaming toward them at full speed, along with a salvage tug, but they are hours away. For the next several hours, the K-314 floats in a tense limbo. The American carrier group moves on, leaving the destroyers to babysit the cripple. The Soviet crew sits in the dark, the boat rolling sickeningly in the swell. They eat cold rations. They speak in whispers. Evsienko spends the time reviewing the charts. He traces the path of the Kittyhawk and his own submarine. He looks at the depth curves, the salinity gradients, the temperature profiles of the Sea of Japan for that day. He begins to suspect that the silence of the carrier wasn't silence at all. It was a deception created by the water. The Sea of Japan is not a uniform bathtub of water. It is a complex, layered cake of different currents. Cold, fresh water from the north mixes with warm, salty water from the south. These layers have different densities. And sound, which travels as a pressure wave, is lazy. It wants to travel the path of least resistance. When sound hits a boundary between a cold layer and a warm layer, it doesn't always pass through. Sometimes it bends. Sometimes it bounces, and sometimes it creates a shadow zone. Evsienko realizes that, as he was rising from the deep, he might have passed through a thermal layer so sharp, so distinct, that it acted like a mirror. The noise of the carrier, thundering on the surface, might have been bouncing off this layer, reflecting back up toward the surface, or refracting horizontally, leaving the water directly beneath the carrier in a cone of acoustic darkness. He had ascended into a blind spot big enough to hide an aircraft carrier. But this theory, while scientifically sound, offers no comfort. It implies that their technology, their training, and their tactics are vulnerable to the whims of nature. It means that the millions of rubles spent on sonar research can be nullified by a sunny day that warms the surface water a few degrees more than expected. As dawn breaks over the Sea of Japan, the grey shapes of the Soviet rescue fleet finally appear on the horizon. The Petropavlovsk looms large, a reassuring sight of home. The tugboat maneuvers into position. The Americans watch from their destroyers, taking photos, recording signatures, analyzing the rescue operation. They have gathered invaluable intelligence on how the Soviets handle a submarine disaster. The K314 is hooked up to the tug. The journey home will be slow and shameful. Evsienko knows his career is effectively over. He will face a tribunal. There will be questions, accusations of incompetence. But as the submarine is towed away, leaving a wake of oil and debris, the question remains, was it just a thermal layer? Or was there something else? Because later analysis of the sonar tapes would reveal something even stranger. In the minutes leading up to the crash, there was a sound. It wasn't the roar of engines. It wasn't the cavitation of a propeller. It was a soft, rhythmic, pulsing. A sound so low frequency, so subtle, that the automated filters of the Victorized sonar system had categorized it as biologic ocean noise. The computer had decided the Kittyhawk was a whale. This revelation opens a new chapter in the investigation. It suggests that the Americans weren't just lucky. It suggests that the acoustic signature of a supercarrier is far more complex and deceptive than Soviet naval intelligence had ever predicted. And it raises the question, if a carrier can sound like a whale, what else are we missing? The crew of the K314 is going home, but the Americans are still out there. And the Kittyhawk, though damaged, is still sailing. The collision has exposed a terrifying vulnerability in submarine warfare, one that both superpowers will now race to understand. But the true shock, the piece of the puzzle that Evsienko hasn't seen yet, lies in the American damage report. When the Kittyhawk pulls into port for repairs, the engineers will find something lodged in the hull that shouldn't be there. Something that changes the narrative from a simple accident to a near-catastrophic interplay of spycraft and silence. The USS Kittyhawk limps into the US naval base at Subic Bay in the Philippines. It is a humiliating return for the pride of the 7th Fleet. The massive vessel, usually a symbol of unassailable power, is listing slightly. The flight deck remains busy, but the mood below decks is grim. They are not just returning to repair a hole in the hull, they are returning with a crime scene attached to their keel. As the water is pumped out of the massive dry dock, revealing the underbelly of the Leviathan, a team of naval intelligence officers and engineers descends into the damp, concrete canyon. They are not there to fix the steel. They are there to harvest the evidence. Embedded deep in the starboard bow, ripped through the 2-inch armoured plating and lodged directly into a fuel void, is a massive, jagged shard of metal. It is bronze, twisted by the violence of the impact, but unmistakable. It is a section of the K314's 7-bladed propeller. This is the twist. The collision was not just an accident, it was an intelligence jackpot. In the Cold War, a submarine's propeller design is its most closely guarded secret. The geometry of the blades, their curve, their pitch, the way they slice through the water determines the submarine's acoustic signature. If you know the shape of the screw, you can calculate exactly what sound it makes at specific speeds. You can feed that data into the computers of every American destroyer and attack submarine, effectively rendering that class of Soviet boat naked to sonar. The Soviets didn't just get run over, they accidentally handed the United States Navy the physical key to tracking their entire Victor I fleet. While American engineers are carefully extracting this bronze prize, wrapping it in tarps to shield it from prying eyes, a different kind of horror is unfolding in Moscow. Captain Evsienko has returned to a reception that is colder than the waters of the Sea of Japan. He is not greeted as a survivor, he is processed as a liability. The Soviet High Command is analyzing the incident report, and they find a terrifying detail that Evsienko missed in the chaos. When the Kittyhawk ran over the submarine, the impact occurred directly aft of the submarine's missile compartment. The K-314 was not on a training mission, it was fully loaded for war. Inside its forward tubes were Type 5365 wake-homing torpedoes. But in the specialized storage racks, the submarine carried 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, weapons designed to incinerate an entire carrier battle group in a single flash. The collision had crushed the hull plates only feet away from the warhead storage. The thrill of this story shifts from a naval accident to a near-apocalyptic event. Had the carrier's keel struck 3 meters further forward, it would not have just scraped the paint. It could have crushed the pressure hull around the nuclear warheads. A conventional explosion of the torpedo propellant could have scattered plutonium across the Sea of Japan, or worse, triggered a fizzle yield, a low-order nuclear detonation. Imagine the scenario. A nuclear explosion occurs directly underneath a US aircraft carrier during a tense military exercise. There would be no time for explanations. No time for the hotline between Washington and Moscow. The Americans would assume a first strike. The retributive launch orders would have been transmitted before the mushroom cloud had even settled. The world had stood on the brink of World War III because of a thermal layer and a blind spot, and nobody knew until the engineers looked at the dent. Back in the Philippines, the American intelligence teams are realizing something else. They analyze the hull of the Kittyhawk and the scrape marks. They simulate the collision, and they discover a chilling fact about the Soviet captain's behavior. Evsienko hadn't just lost the carrier. He had been aggressive. The trajectory analysis shows that before the collision, the K-314 had actually penetrated the destroyer screen successfully. Evsienko had gotten inside the perimeter. He had effectively killed the carrier in a simulation sense before the accident happened. He was right underneath them. This changes the American perspective entirely. The narrative shifts from the clumsy Soviets crashed to the deadly Soviets got within killing range undetected, and only failed because they tried to surface. It is a wake-up call. The Victor I class, previously thought to be noisy and obsolete compared to the new American Los Angeles class, had proven it could sneak up on a supercarrier. The accident was a tactical failure for the Soviets, but a strategic shock for the Americans. Their defensive screens were porous. But the mystery remains. Why did Evsienko surface? The Soviet inquiry uncovers the final piece of the tactical puzzle. They interrogate the sonar operators from the K-314 relentlessly. They replay the tapes that were recovered, the ones that weren't blank. They find a discrepancy in the American maneuvers. On the night of the crash, the Kittyhawk was not just sailing. It was performing a specific erratic maneuver known as sprint and drift. This is a tactic where a ship speeds up to clear an area, creating massive noise, and then cuts its engines to drift silently and listen for pursuers. The Kittyhawk had cut its engines just as Evsienko lost contact. The silence wasn't just the thermal layer, it was the carrier entering a drift phase. The whale noise the computer detected was likely the idling auxiliary machinery or the slow rotation of a cooling shaft. Evsienko had surfaced because he thought the carrier had moved away. In reality, the carrier was hiding right on top of him, waiting and listening. The twist is that both captains were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The American captain was running silent to catch a sub. The Soviet captain was surfacing to find the lost ship. They were two masters of warfare playing a game of blind man's bluff in a dark room, and they collided in the center. Now, the Americans possess the bronze propeller fragment. They ship it to the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Card Rock, Maryland. There, metallurgists and acousticians begin to reverse engineer the Soviet alloy. They learn about the manufacturing defects in Soviet casting. They learn about the specific singing frequency the propeller makes at 20 knots. They feed this data into the SOSUS network, the underwater listening arrays that line the ocean floor. Suddenly, the ocean becomes transparent. The collision of K-314 didn't just cripple one submarine. By handing over that piece of metal, Evsienko inadvertently compromised the stealth of every single Victor-class submarine in the Soviet Navy. But there is one final, lingering question. A detail that the sailors on the deck of the Kittyhawk noticed, but that hasn't been explained. When the submarine surfaced and the Americans shone their lights on the conning tower, they saw damage. But they also saw something strange painted on the side of the sail, visible for just a moment before the sub drifted into the dark. It wasn't a tactical number. It wasn't a Soviet naval ensign. It looked like a modification. A set of sensors that didn't belong on a Victor I. The K314 wasn't just an attack submarine. It was a test bed. And in Part 4, we will reveal what they were really testing and why the collision doomed a secret program that could have changed the balance of the Cold War. The accident might have been the best thing to happen to the free world. The bronze propeller fragment sitting in a laboratory in Maryland was a trophy, yes. But for the naval strategists at the Pentagon, the collision of K314 was not a victory. As the adrenaline of the incident faded and the cold, hard analysis began, the initial narrative of clumsy Soviets began to crumble. In its place, a far more terrifying picture emerged, one that suggested the United States Navy had fundamentally misunderstood the enemy they were facing. The shock of this story does not lie in the collision itself, but in the reason why Captain Evsienko was directly behind the USS Kittyhawk. For decades, American naval doctrine relied on a single assumption: silence is survival. The US invested billions of dollars in making their submarines and surface ships quieter. They built reduction gears that hummed rather than ground. They designed propellers that sliced the water without cavitation. The logic was simple. If the Soviets cannot hear us, they cannot kill us. But the crash of 1984 revealed that the Soviets had realized they could not win the game of silence. Their manufacturing technology lagged behind the West. They could not build quiet turbines. So, instead of trying to out-quiet the Americans, they decided to out-think them. The K314 was not just listening for sound. It was hunting a scar. The strange modification and the erratic behavior of the submarine pointed to a classified Soviet initiative known as the System for Detecting Wake Traces, or SOX, Sistema Obnarużenia Kilwaternego, Slader. An aircraft carrier like the Kittyhawk does not just make noise. It is a massive heat engine. It dumps millions of gallons of warm water used to cool its steam condensers into the freezing ocean. It leaves a trail of radioactive isotopes, however minute, from its reactors. It churns the water, creating a turbulent wake of microbubbles that can linger for hours, long after the sound of the engines has faded. To a standard sonar, this wake is invisible. But to the Soviet sensors being tested and refined during this era, the wake of an aircraft carrier was a glowing highway in the dark. Evsienko was likely not relying solely on his ears. He was following the physical trail of the ship, the change in water density, the spike in temperature, the chemical signature of the anti-fouling paint chipping off the carrier's hull. This is why he was positioned directly astern, in the baffles, the blind spot. He wasn't just hiding, he was sniffing the trail like a bloodhound. This revelation sent a shockwave through the US Naval Command. If the Soviets could track a ship by its wake, then silence was irrelevant. The millions spent on sound dampening were wasted. You cannot silence a wake. You cannot hide the fact that an 80,000-ton ship physically displaces water. The collision proved that the Soviet Union had developed a way to negate the primary American advantage. They didn't need to hear the Kittyhawk, they just needed to cross its path, find the scent, and follow it to the kill. And the kill would have been unavoidable. The damage to the Kittyhawk confirmed another chilling reality. The submarine had surfaced, yes, but before that, it had achieved a perfect firing solution. In the tubes of the K314 were the Type 5365 wake-homing torpedoes. These weapons are the stuff of nightmares for a carrier captain. A standard torpedo uses sonar to find a ship. The ship can defend itself by dropping noisemakers, decoys that sound like the ship to lure the torpedo away. But a wake-homing torpedo ignores sound. It ignores decoys. It detects the turbulence of the ship's wake and performs a weaving pattern, crossing back and forth through the turbulent water like a snake, climbing up the wake until it smashes into the screws or the keel of the target. By positioning himself in the wake, Evsienko had proven that a Soviet submarine could enter the killing zone of a supercarrier, immune to decoys, and deliver a fatal blow. The collision was an accident. The positioning was a successful simulation of a carrier assassination. But there was a darker layer to this mystery, one that would not be fully understood until the arrest of John Anthony Walker a year later, in 1985. Investigators were plagued by a question. The ocean is vast. The Sea of Japan is over 370,000 square miles. Even with wake detection technology, you have to find the wake first. How did a noisy, older generation Victor I submarine find the Kittyhawk carrier group so quickly in the first place, especially when the Americans were practicing radio silence? The answer was treason. At the very moment K-314 was hunting the Kittyhawk, the Soviets were reading the Americans' mail. The Walker spy ring had provided the Soviet Navy with the key lists the daily codes used to encrypt US naval communications. It is highly probable that Captain Evsienko didn't just stumble upon the Kittyhawk. He was likely vectored in by Soviet naval intelligence, who were reading the Kittyhawk's own position reports. The Americans were broadcasting their location in code, thinking they were secure, while the Soviets were decoding the messages in real time and drawing an X on Evsienko's map. The collision was the physical manifestation of a catastrophic intelligence failure. The US Navy was sailing naked, stripped of its secrets by a spy, and hunted by a submarine using physics they hadn't fully counted. The Kittyhawk didn't just run over a submarine, it ran over the illusion of American invulnerability. The aftermath for Captain Vladimir Evsienko was swift and brutal. Upon his return to base, he was not hailed as a bold captain who challenged the Americans. In the rigid, unforgiving structure of the Soviet Navy, he was an embarrassment. He had lost the element of surprise. He had damaged a nuclear asset. He had exposed the fleet to ridicule. Evsienko was relieved of his command. He was never given another submarine. His career, which had been built on the mastery of the deep, ended at a desk. The Soviet investigation laid the blame squarely on his shoulders, citing his failure to maintain safe separation. They ignored the fact that he had successfully tracked the target. They only cared that he had been caught. For the USS Kittyhawk, the scar on the hull was repaired, but the psychological scar remained. The team spirit exercise continued, but the tactics changed. The US Navy began to aggressively research wake detection countermeasures. They realized that the ocean was no longer a place where they could hide. The incident of March 1984 stands as a pivotal moment in the Cold War, not because shots were fired, but because they weren't. If the Kittyhawk had struck the submarine 3 meters forward, crushing the nuclear torpedoes, the resulting explosion would have vaporized the carrier's keel. The US would have lost 5,000 sailors in an instant. The Reagan administration would have had no choice but to retaliate. The silos in North Dakota and the mobile launchers in Siberia would have opened. Civilization could have ended on a Tuesday night in the Sea of Japan, all because of a thermal layer and a miscalculation of depth. In the end, the mystery of the collision is solved not by looking at who steered left or who steered right, but by understanding the desperate, high-stakes game of technology and espionage that defined the era. The Americans learned that their silent ships were leaving glowing trails in the water. The Soviets learned that even with the perfect trap, the ocean is a chaotic, unforgiving variable. And the world learned just how thin the line was between a naval incident and a nuclear holocaust. The piece of the K-314's propeller remained in American custody for years, a heavy bronze reminder that in the silent war beneath the waves, the enemy is always closer than you think. And sometimes, you don't know they are there until you run them over. This was the story of the crash that should have started World War III. But instead, it ended with a drift in the dark, a terrified crew, and a secret that changed naval warfare forever.